self-surrender. We practice bhakti or devotion in order to achieve communion with the Supreme Master. We look upon him with faith and reverence. By degrees, we become so closely intimate to him that every other object loses prominence in our eyes. This is submission to the will of the master, or in other words, the beginning of self-surrender. So dash is the beginning of self-surrender. Answer is
Beginning.
Submission.
beginning is the beginning of self-surrender. Good
Submission.
system. That's a very good googly. Okay. This is submission to the will of the master. In other words, the beginning of self-surrender. It goes on developing as our faith grows stronger. It brings us to a stationary condition, stopping the oscillations of the mind. In due course, we begin to feel ourselves overpowered by some great force which drives our mind away from everything else. We become free of unwanted activities, sticking all the time to the right functioning of the organs or the indriyas. Self surrender is nothing but a state of complete resignation to the will of the master with total disregard of the self. Underline that. Self surrender is nothing but a state of complete resignation to the will of the master with total disregard of the self. A permanent stay in this condition leads to the beginning of state of self negation. So, first is submission, then gradually self surrender. Then, when that peaks, the state of self negation. So, you cannot get self negation without self surrender, and you cannot get self surrender without submission. Serena? Submission, SSS, submission to self surrender to self negation. So, as and when the self surrender grows, faith in the master becomes stronger. So, that's the intermediate state. Okay. Anyway, when we surrender our ಪಟಾಕಿ ಹೊಡೆದಿನೋ ಭರತ್ ಆಯ್ತಾ ಹೊಡೆದು ಮಳೆ ಬರಲಿಲ್ವಾ ಓ ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ಲಿ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಮಂತ್ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಊರಿಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇದೀವಿ ಹುಬ್ಳಿದು
ಇವೆಂಟ್ ಇದೆ
ಹಾ ಹುಬ್ಳಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡೋಣ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಕೊಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ 16 ಅಥವಾ 23ನೇ ತಾರೀಕು
ಬರೀ
15, 16 ಅಥವಾ 22, 23 ಎರಡರಲ್ಲಿ ಒಂದು
15-16 ನಮ್ದ್ರಾಗ ಇವೆಂಟ್ ಐತಿ
ಏನಿದೆ
15-16 ನಮ್ಮ ಇವೆಂಟ್ ಐತಿ ಸರ್ ಹುಬ್ಳಿದಾಗ
ಅದೇ ಏನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀರಾ
ಅದೇನೋ ಮಕ್ಕಳಿಗೆ ಹೆಂಗ ಬೆಳೆಸೋದು ಅಂತ ಕಲಿಸ್ತಾರೆ
ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಬೆಳೆಸೋದ ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ಕಣೆ ಮದುವೆ ಆಗ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಮುಂಚೆನೆ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಕಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ನಿಂಗೆ
ಪೇಡ್ ಐತಿ ಸರ್
ನೋಡ್ರಿ he is getting prepared in advance. Before his marriage only he is being taught how to look after children. And ಭರತ್ ಹೋಗಿ ಫಸ್ಟೇ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಅಡ್ಮಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಿರ್ತಾನೆ ಆಯ್ತು ಗುಡ್ ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ ಗೋಪಾಲ್ ಕೃಷ್ಣನ ಕರಿ ಆಗ್ಯಾರ ಆ ಕೋರ್ಸಿಗೆ ಅವನಿಗೂ ಬೇಕಲ್ವ ಅದು ಸೊ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಬರೀ ಯೂತ್ಗ ಮದುವೆ ಆಗದಿರೋ ಯೂತ್ಗ ಅಥವಾ ಮದುವೆ ಆಗಿರೋ ಯೂತ್ಗ
ಇರ್ತಿಗಲ್ಲ ಸರ್ ಇದು ಪೇರೆಂಟ್ಸ್
ಅದೇ ಪೇರೆಂಟ್ಸ್ಗೆ ಅದೇ ವುಡ್ ಬಿ ಪೇರೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಒಬ್ರು ಪೇರೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಒಬ್ರು ವುಡ್ ಬಿ ಪೇರೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಹೌದಾ ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ ಎಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಯಾರು ಮಾಡ್ತಿರೋದು ಪ್ರೋಗ್ರಾಮು
ಅವ್ರ ಪುಣೆಯಿಂದ ಯಾರೋ ಒಬ್ರು ಇದಾರ
ಪುಣೆಯಿಂದನಾ ಓಕೆ ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ 22, 23 ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗತ್ತೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. 15, 16 ಆಗಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೆ 22, 23 ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾಗತ್ತೆ.
ಹ್ಮ್.
ಆಯ್ತು, ತೊಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಪ್ಪ. ನೋಡೋಣ ಸರಿಯಾ? ಸರಿ, ಮುಂದುವರ್ಸೋಣ ಹಂಗಾರೆ. When we surrender ourselves to the great master, we begin to attract a constant flow of the highest divine force from him. So that's the advantage of self-surrender. ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? We begin to attract a constant flow of the highest divine force from him. In this state, a man thinks and does only that which is his master's will. He feels nothing in the world to be his belonging, but everything as a sacred trust from the master, and he does everything thinking it to be his master's biddings. His will, his will becomes completely subservient to the will of the master. ಸೊ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರ್ಡ್ ಆದಾಗ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? ಡಿವೈನ್ ಫೋರ್ಸ್ ಹರಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರು ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಕಂಟಿನ್ಯೂಸ್ ಆಗಿ, and the person's will become completely subservient to the will of the master, and he does everything as his master's bidding. A beautiful example of surrender is presented to us by Bharata, the son of Dasharatha, when he went to the forest along with the people of Ayodhya to induce his brother Rama to return. In reply to the entreaties of the people, Rama gravely replied that he would be quite willing to return to the capital provided Bharat asked him to do so. All eyes were turned towards Bharata, who was himself there to induce him to return. But he calmly replied, "It is not for me to command, but only to follow." The Bhagavad Gita too deals with the state of self-surrender. It is not an ordinary thing to be achieved easily. It begins after complete negation of all the senses and faculties. Underline ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. It begins after the complete surrender of all the senses and faculties, for which we proceed by elementary rules of devotion. ಸೊ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ಸ್ ಯಾವಾಗ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ 8th ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಆಗ್ಬೇಕಲ್ಲ, 8th ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಆಗೋಷ್ಟದೇ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ? ವಿ ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ ನೆಗೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಆಲ್ ದ ಸೆನ್ಸಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಫ್ಯಾಕಲ್ಟೀಸ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಅದಾದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ ಆಗ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಶುರು ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸರಿನಾ? We submit to our master, thinking him to be a superhuman being. We love him with faith and reverence, trying by all means to attract his attention and favor. For this purpose, we connect our links with him and the light of the worldly relationships only for the sake of facility. We think of him as father, brother, friend, or master, beloved. The process is taken up in the right manner. If taken up in the right earnest, is greatly helpful to a disciple. The strong link of attraction thus established leads him to a state of complete devotion and surrender. The conception of the Guru as a mother, in my opinion, is by far the most appropriate and advantageous to the disciple. A mother is a very embodiment of love and affection. Only a mother's heart can forbear with patience all the troubles and miseries caused to her by her son, thinking all the while, trying to provide for her son's comfort and happiness. The same is the position of the real master or the Guru, who is the spiritual mother of the disciple. As such, the Guru is always on the lookout for the spiritual welfare of the child, the disciple. It is due to the affectionate attachment of the Guru with his disciple that the attention of the great father with whom his spiritual mother is so closely connected is directed towards God. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇವಾಗ ಸ್ಪಿರಿಚುವಲ್ ಫಾದರ್ ಯಾರು, ಸ್ಪಿರಿಚುವಲ್ ಮದರ್ ಯಾರು, ಚೈಲ್ಡ್ ಯಾರು ಹೇಳ್ರಪ್ಪ?
So, child is us, spiritual mother is Guru, spiritual father is God.
ಈಗ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ. So we are the children, Guru is the spiritual mother, and God is the spiritual father. Okay. A mother's affection is well known, but people know very little of Guru's affection, still less of God's affection. The function of the mother and of a true Guru are closely similar. The mother retains a child within her womb for a certain duration. The Guru too retains the spiritual child within his mental sphere for a certain duration. During this period, the disciple, like the baby in the womb, sucks his energy and gets nourishment from the spiritual waves of the Guru's thoughts. When the time matures, he is born in the brighter world and then his own spiritual life begins. So nourishment ಹೆಂಗ್ ಬರುತ್ತೆ? Spiritual waves of the guru's thoughts nourishes the spiritual child. ಆಯ್ತಾ? womb ಯಾವುದು? ಮೆಂಟಲ್ womb, ಮೆಂಟಲ್ ಸ್ಪಿಯರ್. The guru retains the spiritual child in his mental sphere. If the disciple enters the mental sphere of the guru, surrendering all his belongings to him, it takes only 7 months to deliver him into the brighter world. But the process is generally delayed for a considerable time because while in the guru's mental sphere, the disciple retains the consciousness of his own thoughts and feelings. Thus, we find that the position of the guru is much as the theme of the mother. The conception of the guru as a spiritual mother promotes within us the feeling of love, reverence, and surrender, which are the main factors of spiritual life. Sarina. Love, reverence, and surrender. What are the main factors of a spiritual life? ಅಂತ ಕೊಟ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ರಿಯಾಲಿಟಿ ಅಟ್ ಡಾನ್ ಅಂತ ಕೊಡ್ತಾರೆ. What all you will write? All things you will write whatever you think at that moment. And they would have taken this sentence directly from the book. ಸರಿನಾ? So love, reverence and surrender. These are the main factors of spiritual life. ಎಲ್ಲ ಬರೆದಿರ್ತೀರ. ಮೆಡಿಟೇಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಬರೀತೀರಾ, ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಮಿಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಬರೀತೀರಾ, ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ರಿಮೆಂಬರೆನ್ಸ್ ಅಂತ ಬರೀತೀರಾ, ಗುರು ಅಂತ ಬರೀತೀರಾ. Everything, whatever you can on the spot, you can think of, you'll write. But they would have taken directly from the book. Sarina. Sages have classified disciples under two main heads, Manumata and Gurumata. This is also a question. Manmata and Gurumata, not Manmata. Manumata. Bharat, ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇಟ್ಕೋ. ಮನ್ಮತ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಮನುಮತ. ಸರಿನಾ? The former, that is Manumatas, are those who approach the Guru with some particular worldly end in view, such as relief from worldly misery, desire for wealth, etc. They submit to him only as long as they are hopeful in the achievement of their desires. When they meet disappointment in this respect, they are off. For such disciples, the question of obedience or submission even does not arise. What to think of surrender? ಸೊ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಥರ ಬರೀತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒಬಿಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್ ಬರುತ್ತೆ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಸರೆಂಡರ್. ಹಿಂದಿನ ಪೇಜಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಓದಿದ್ರೆ SSS ಅಂತ ಓದ್ರಲ್ಲ. ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್, ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್, ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ನೆಗೇಷನ್. ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್ ಮುಚ್ಚೆ ಏನು ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಒಬಿಡಿಯನ್ಸ್. ಓಕೆ. ಸೊ ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್ಗೂ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ಗೂ ಮಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ಬರುತ್ತೆ? ಸೊ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒಬಿಡಿಯನ್ಸ್, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್. ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಫೇತ್ ಆ್ಯಡ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ಸರೆಂಡರ್, ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್. ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ ಪೀಕ್ ಆಯಿತು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ನೆಗೇಷನ್. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಯ್ತು? ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒಬಿಡಿಯನ್ಸ್, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್. ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್ ಜೊತೆಗೆ ಫೇತ್ ಆ್ಯಡ್ ಆದರೆ, ಆಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ವೆನ್ ದ ಅಭ್ಯಾಸಿ submits to the will of the master, the faith increases. ಫೇತ್ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಆಗ್ತಾ then there is self surrender. ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ ಪೀಕ್ ಆಯಿತು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ನೆಗೇಷನ್. ಸರಿನಾ? Gurumata's disciples are those who obey the commands of the master in all matters and try to submit to his will in all possible ways. Submission begins with obedience. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒಬಿಡಿಯನ್ಸ್, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್. ಸೊ OSSS ಮಧ್ಯದ ಎಸ್ ಮಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್ 2 SS ಮಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ F ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ OSFSS. ಒಬೇಷನ್, ಸರೆಂಡರ್, ಫೇತ್, ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ ಮತ್ತು obedience, surrender, faith, self-surrender, self-negation. ಸೊ ಬರ್ಕೊಳ್ರಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಓ, ಆಮೇಲೆ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಆರೋ ಹಾಕಿ ಎಸ್. ಎಸ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಸಬ್ಮಿಷನ್, ಎಸ್ ಯು ಹಾಕೊಳ್ರಿ. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಕೆಳಗಡೆ ಹಾಕಿದ್ರೆ ಆರೋ ಪಕ್ಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಎಫ್ ಅಂತ ಹಾಕ್ರಿ, ಫೈತ್. ಸೊ ಆರೋ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಬರುತ್ತೋ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಅದು ಎಸ್ ಎಸ್, ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್. ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಆರೋ ಹಾಕ್ರಿ, ಹೋಯ್ತು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ನೆಗೇಷನ್. ಸರಿನಾ? Submission begins with obedience. When we are deeply impressed by the great powers of the Master of a higher attainments in spirituality, we feel inwardly inclined to follow his biddings. But often the effect remains upon us only when we are in his presence, but when we are away, we become unmindful of him. Repeated association with him for some time brings us in closer touch with the great soul, and his supremacy begins to get established in our heart. We accept him as our guide in all matters pertaining to our spiritual advancement. The result is that we remember him frequently. When we are perfectly convinced of his superior capabilities, only then our submission in the true sense begins. We go on with it and practice as we are directed. We think of pleasing him by our actions. The idea of the right or wrong too begins to assume prominence in our heart, and we feel inclined to refrain from evil. We consequently adopt the line of virtue so that we might be able to please our great master. It is our primary motive, for we wish to be saved from the miseries of the next life. But so far we reserve to ourselves the right of discretion, and therefore responsible for all our actions, whether good or bad. At a higher state of self-surrender, such a discretionary power becomes almost extinct, and a man does everything thinking it to be his master's will. The question of right or wrong does not arise at all in his mind, or it becomes absolutely certain that by following his master's will, he is doing the only right thing, and he does nothing but the right, feeling it to be his master's will. ರೈಟ್ ರಾಂಗ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೊಟ್ಟೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ಸರಿ, ಇಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಲ್ಸೋಣ ಇವತ್ತು. ಏನಾದ್ರು ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಇದ್ರೆ ಕೇಳ್ರಿ. ಎನಿ ಕ್ವೆಶನ್ಸ್? ಎನಿ ಕ್ವೆಶನ್ಸ್ ಅಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಯಾನಿಂಗ್? छुपाकर यान करते हैं, छुप छुपाकर यान करते हैं. यान का मतलब है ये. यान का मतलब वो नहीं है कि प्रयाण करना है, वो यान नहीं है. So any questions? So this is a important chapter, self surrender. So self surrender is like in the center. On this side you have obedience and submission. On this side you have the self negation. So that like in the center. So only at the stage of self surrender the ownership transfers to the master. Okay, yeah. At the first point we are 100, master is 0 before we come into spirituality. At the 8th point, as we progress from the first point to the 8th point, the ownership of the master gradually increases and the ownership of the abhyasi gradually decreases. So by the time we come to the stage of self-surrender, it is 50-50. Even at the 8th point, you can say it is like 51 for ourselves and 49 for the master. At the stage of 8th point, we tip the balance. Master become 51 and we become 49. So from the 8th point up to the 13th point, it is entirely the master. In other words, his state goes on increasing from 51 to 100 and our state goes on decreasing from 49 to 0. So by the time we come to the end of the 12th point, before we cross the Satpad, we are 0 and master is 100. So the entire journey from preventing you passing through the Brahmarandra and going out as a soul, and then helping you pass through the Satpad, and then helping you to enter into the central region and traversing through the central region up to the central, it is master only. So we are 0 and master is 100. That's how the work is. Send. So first point is we are 100, master is 0. 12th point is master is 100, we are 0. At the 8th point, the controlling state passes on to master, 5149. Very clear mathematically. Disinvestment ಅಂತ ಮಾಡ್ತಾರಲ್ಲ government. When they do disinvestment of the company, 51 pays government percent, government retains the stake, 49% they give it to the public. Because the government want to exercise the controlling stake. So something similar here. So what happens between 8th point and 9th point? The guru nourishes the disciple in his mental womb by the waves of his thoughts. If the disciple gets adequately nourished, then what happens? The disciple is delivered in the 9th point into the brighter world. If the disciple retains their own mental, what do you say, their own conceptions, their own thinking, feelings, everything, then it takes a bit more time for the guru to deliver the baby into the 9th point. That's the reason 9th point is the point of soul replication. In the 9th point, the guru splits the soul and replicates one part of it into the brighter world. Then the disciple's life is at two levels, one here, one there. Two the entities are there. That entity which is delivered into the brighter world is called as the spiritual entity. But that cannot occur before 8th point. Only if the self-surrender stabilizes to a certain extent at the 8th point, the soul replication can occur at the 9th point. ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತಾ? ಎಲ್ಲ ಹೆಂಗೆ ತಲೆ ಅಲ್ಲಾಡಿಸ್ತೀರಾ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಆಡಿಸ್ದಂಗೂ ಇರಬೇಕು, ಆಡಿಸ್ದಂಗೂ ಇರಬಾರದು. ನಮ್ಮ ಪೇಷನ್ಸ್ ಬರ್ತಾರೆ ಆಯ್ತಾ. ದೇ ಸಮಥಿಂಗ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ as ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟಿಕೋಲಿಸ್. ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟಿಕೋಲಿಸ್ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಕತ್ತಾಡಿಸ್ತಾನೆ ಇರ್ತಾರೆ. ದಟ್ಸ್ ಎ ಇಲ್ನೆಸ್ ಆಯ್ತಾ. ನೀವೆಲ್ಲ ನನಗೆ ಟಾರ್ಟಿಕೋಲಿಸ್ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ತೋರಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ ಆಯ್ತಾ. ಯಾಕೆಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಆಡಿಸ್ದಂಗೂ ಇರಬೇಕು, ಆಡಿಸದೇ ಇರೋಂಗೂ ಇರಬೇಕು ಆಯ್ತಾ. ಏನಾದ್ರು ಆಡಿಸಿದೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ನೀವು ಅಬ್ಸರ್ವ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ ಸರಿ ಅಂತ ನನ್ನ ಮೇಲೆ ಎತ್ತಾಕ್ಬೋದಲ್ಲ ಆಯ್ತು. ಸೊ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಚಾಪ್ಟರ್ ಸೆಲ್ಫ್ ಸರೆಂಡರ್. ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ ಮತ ಭರತ್? ಯಾವ ಮತನೋ?
ಗುರು ಮತ, ಮನು ಮತ.
ಇನ್ನೊಂದ್ಸತಿ ಹೇಳು.
ಗುರು ಮತ, ಮನು ಮತ.
ಏನು ಮನ್ಮಥ?
ಮನು ಮತ.
ಮನು ಮತ ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಎಂಫಸೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ಮನು ಮತ ಇಲ್ದರೆ ಮನ್ಮಥ ಮನ್ಮಥ ಅಂತ ಬರ್ತದೆ ಆಯ್ತಾ. ಮನ್ಮಥದ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಕೇಳಿದ್ರೆ ನೀವಿದು ಮನ್ಮಥ ನನಗೆ ಬಾಣ ಹೊಡೆದಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಬರ್ತೀರ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಎಕ್ಸಾಮಲ್ಲಿ ಆಯ್ತಾ. ನಮ್ಮ ಭಾಸ್ಕರ್ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಮನ್ಮಥ ಬಾಣ ಹೊಡೆದಿದ್ದಾನೆ, ತತ್ತರಿಸಿ ಹೋಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ.